Welcome to the first installment of CTMU Apologetics. This is going to be an introductory installment, so we will go over some of the informal criticisms levied against the CTMU and how to optimally respond to them. Ideally, you'd watch the debate module as well for a maximally clear understanding of how to apply the course content. We will also discuss how the approach of introducing the CTMU must be made within conversation, debate, and dialogue. Now, to start, to engage in CTMU apologetics, the most important prerequisite is to understand the criticisms that are usually levied against the CTMU by so-called critics. For if there were no deterrents from the CTMU philosophy, there would be no reason to combat others on its grounds and justification. Luckily, the most common criticisms against the CTMU are informal and largely not rigorous or precise. They almost all broadly cover the following notions: that the CTMU is incomprehensible, the CTMU is pseudoscience, CTMU terminology is not defined, the CTMU is not peer-reviewed, the CTMU isn't scientific, Chris Langan doesn't have qualifications, etc. We will be dissecting every one of these criticisms, the implications they entail, the validity of the concerns, and their relevance to a negation of the validity of the CTMU itself, which is the primary task, which is to determine whether the CTMU is invalid or false or not. Okay? As a preface, there are three major ways by which you can combat the following claims. Either dispute the claim itself, demonstrate how it's irrelevant to whether the CTMU is valid and correct or not, or both. I broadly suggest taking the second path as it highlights the stupidity of the criticism better by showing that it falls short of accomplishing the task that we talk about, which is to prove the CTMU is false or invalid. None of the following claims in any way come close to accomplishing that task, and that is worth highlighting. Now, to start, number one, the CTMU is incomprehensible. Firstly, the notion that the CTMU is incomprehensible is loaded. Incomprehensible to whom? To an individual? To most people? To some people? Or to all people? Now, if the CTMU is incomprehensible to an individual, some individuals, or even a majority of individuals, it would necessarily imply that there are some people who are capable of understanding the CTMU, which would make the CTMU categorically not incomprehensible universally, just incomprehensible to some, maybe, or maybe even if we're being extremely charitable to saying most people, it would still not prove the proclamation that the CTMU is incomprehensible. All that it would prove is that there are some people that don't comprehend the CTMU, right? And so the importance of this line of thinking is in clarifying the obfuscation that is embedded in the claim that the CTMU is incomprehensible. The message is that the CTMU can't be understood. It cannot be understood. It doesn't have the capacity to be understood. But that's simply not correct, as there are people who understand it when we can demonstrate that. One could argue for the reasons that these people have put more time, effort, and rigor into their reading of the CTMU, in opposition to those who claim it is incomprehensible. As is the line of defense, the attack must also be directive. So you could ask questions like, is the CTMU incomprehensible to you or to everyone? How come there are people who understand the CTMU if you're saying the CTMU is incomprehensible? Is it a possibility that maybe you don't understand the CTMU because you haven't put enough time and effort into studying it as the people who have? Do you believe that for one to categorize a work as incomprehensible, it shouldn't be the case that they don't immediately understand its entirety after one read? In conjunction, drawing comparisons and parallels will also be useful, as will be displayed in multiple different critiques. So, for example, do you think Hegel, Kant, and other philosophers' works are incomprehensible if you don't understand their works, or if some people on Reddit don't understand their works? Now, the line of reasoning is quite simple. If the CTMU is incomprehensible, it must be universally incomprehensible. If it is not universally incomprehensible, then the CTMU can be comprehended, and it's not to a fault of the CTMU itself as being incomprehensible. Now, it's not relevant whatsoever the amount of people that agree with the notion that the CTMU is incomprehensible. This is an ad populum fallacy. A lot of people engage in this all the time. All that matters is that there are people who comprehend it and that have the capacity to comprehend it, a point at which the criticism ultimately fails. Now, as a final touch on this criticism, there's a distinction that must be made between the implication of the idea that the CTMU is incomprehensible, and that's to what end. So, is the CTMU incomprehensible in that it can't be intelligibly understood, and hence the CTMU can't be correct or valid because it literally cannot be intelligibly understood? Or is it incomprehensible in that it is hard to understand, and hence the CTMU can't be correct or valid? See, neither of these propositions are correct, and the second one especially, even if it was true, doesn't in any shape, way, or form take away from the CTMU's validity or soundness. Number 2, the CTMU is pseudoscience. This one's pretty short. The CTMU can't be a pseudoscience because it's a philosophy. Its aim isn't to make a particular predictive claim about a particular phenomenon in material reality and test an initial hypothesis. The CTMU is a philosophy, a metaphysical system. It categorically, by definition, cannot be a pseudoscience, as it is not even attempting to be a scientific theory or disguise itself as such. Number 3, CTMU terminology is not defined. Now, this criticism begs the question of definition. It assumes a definite standard of definition that needs to be satisfied, which is not actually definite, but relative to the individual that is making the accusation. So that needs to be asked. There can be two ways to go about this. Either the CTMU is not properly defined, to which there needs to be a rigorous demonstration of a standard of definition that needs to be met on the behalf of the accuser, and why it must be this standard and not any other standard. Or the other way is that the CTMU doesn't define its terms at all, meaning like it literally doesn't even attempt to give a proper definition of the terminology it uses. Now, the first form of this criticism can be combated by asking what the standard of definition is, like I previously stated, and why it must be so. And the second form is quite easy to debunk because it can be demonstrably shown to not be the case. You can pick examples of any CTMU concept or CTMU related concept within the CTMU and just highlight its definition. I've done so in my videos previously before. For instance, the following clip. Number 3, Chris Langan doesn't define his terms. This is simply not true. Any word that is a newly introduced term and is used within the CTMU is directly described and illustrated. For example, syndiphianesis is described as difference in sameness, which is further illustrated upon in the CTMU. Another instance of a newly introduced term which is defined is telesis, which is described as ontological potential or ability for different possibilities to exist. This is explained within the telic principle. These are just a few of the endless examples of Chris being very precise with how he defines and explains newly introduced terms. A lot of these neologisms are prefixes in addition to an already understood word, such as self-determinacy, the meaning of which is obvious enough to anybody that has any level of familiarization with any metaphysics, but in case it wasn't, you're in luck because Chris explains it. Number 4, the CTMU is not peer-reviewed. Now, this is pretty easy to respond to. If we were to say that that was the case and the CTMU wasn't peer-reviewed, would that in any way demonstrate that any of the propositions contained within the CTMU are false or invalid? If so, in what way would that be? And if not, then how would it bear any relevance as to whether the CTMU is correct or valid? As the CTMU is not a scientific theory, which leads us to number 5. The CTMU is not scientific. Now, this criticism is often accompanied by a presupposition. The presupposition that science is necessary for the determination of whether something is correct or not, or valid or not. The task is to ask the accuser to demonstrate this to be the case, or demonstrate that it is not relevant to whether the CTMU is correct or valid, as the CTMU is not a scientific theory. The only circumstance under which this criticism could possibly be valid is if the accuser proved something called logical positivism, which is a philosophical notion that statements can only be valid if they can be demonstrated empirically. Now, in this case, the burden is on the accuser, and the folly of the criticism must be honed in on the accuser. To do this very well, I recommend listening to the debate module, wherein I teach how to be tenacious, precise, effective, and rigorous in debates, using examples of my own debates to demonstrate such, but most importantly, I teach you how to win them. Nonetheless, this should be taken Oh, this should take a few sentences to dispatch if the accuser is not well versed in philosophy. The CTMU doesn't have to be scientific to be true because it's a philosophy, a metaphysics. It cannot be disproven by pleading that it is not scientific, as not everything requires it being a scientific theory in order for it to be true. Now, finally, number 6. Chris Langan doesn't have any qualifications. Now, we all know this is not relevant, and as a criticism that is aimed at demonstrating why the CTMU is invalid or untrue, it is either towing or even crossing the lines of an appeal to authority fallacy. It is not relevant at all whether Chris Langan, the author of the CTMU, has any qualifications. It doesn't matter because it is not necessary for the proposition of the CTMU to be true or valid. This doesn't even work even if the CTMU was a scientific theory, because simply saying the author of a scientific theory doesn't have qualifications doesn't demonstrate that the scientific theory is false. Rather, if the proposition is that academics have a consensus that the theory is false, it could possibly work against a scientific theory, because then we would assume that they would have reasons to declare such, though that wouldn't work against the CTMU because the CTMU is, again, not a scientific theory. It's a philosophy, a metaphysics. It doesn't matter if every academic on planet Earth has the same criticisms of it's jargon, it's not scientific. Never in a million years would that prove a single principle or proposition in the CTMU incorrect. Never. Appeal to authority is fallacious, and more importantly, when the authority is spewing the same irrelevant criticisms instead of addressing a single principle within the CTMU and proving it wrong, it becomes even more irrelevant and worthless. Moreover, philosophy as a field doesn't have a particular medium of authority. Philosophers disagree with each other all the time on almost everything. They might have a consensus on the history of philosophy, perhaps, but most academic philosophers disagree with each other on the substance of philosophy all the time, and that's because the object of authority is not scientific. They are propositions about the nature of reality. And to prove how the CTMU is false in that regard, all these academics would have to demonstrate the propositions that the CTMU makes about the nature of reality false.